B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Tainis Daf Chav Zayin. We're going to start 4 lines from the top of the Amud. And the Gemara is going to take us back to the Mishnah on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. Eilu hein ma'amodois. These are what ma'amodois are. And the Mishnah later tells us what are ma'amodois. There's Kehanim, Leviim, Yisraelim that were split up into groups, etc. And then the Mishnah says, Lefi shenemar, since it says in the Pasuk, Tzavas b'nei Yisrael v'chulu, and starts telling us in the Psukim, a source why they made this concept of ma'amodois. So the Gemara is asking, Maika Omar, what does it mean, Eilu hein ma'amodois, these are the ma'amodois, and you're not telling us what the ma'amodois are, you're giving us a source for the ma'amodois. Answers the Gemara, Hochika Omar, you have to read into the Mishnah as follows, Eilu hein ma'amodois, these are the ma'amodois. And before we tell you what the ma'amodois are, Uma tam tiknu ma'amodois, what's the source and reason that they made the ma'amodois? Lefi shenemar, since it says in the Pasuk, Tzavas b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim es korban ilach mili ishay reach nichoyach, reach nichoichi tishmuru lakriv li b'moyadoi, that every person and the community as a whole, as a community, have to bring a korban every day, the korban tomid. Then v'heich korbonoi shel adam korav v'heino imed al gabov. How is it possible for a person to bring a korban and he's not there with the korban, by the korban when it's being brought? He needs some type of, either he's there or his representative is there, and therefore his kinu neviim are rishonim esrim v'arba mishmoris. Therefore the early neviim, we'll soon see who they were, but it was Shmuel HaNavi and David HaMelech. They made this concept of splitting up the Kehanim, Neviim, and Yisraelim into groups. I'll call Mishmar or Mishmar. Each of these 24 groups, Hoya Maimed B'Yerushalayim, there was a representation in Yerushalayim, Shel Kehanim v'Shel Leviim. The Kehanim and Leviim were actually working in the Beis HaMikdash during their week. V'Shel Yisraelim, and there were also some Yisraelim who would go and be there at the time when the Korbanos are brought, and they were representing Klal Yisrael, and on behalf of Klal Yisrael, they were there in Yerushalayim when the Korbanos were being brought. Higiazman Mishmar Lalois, when any particular week, when it was the turn of the next Mishmar, the next group, it was their week, then Kehanim and Leviim oilim Yerushalayim, then the Kehanim and Leviim would go up to Yerushalayim, as would the Yisraelim, etc. Just there were Yisraelim that were, besides for those that went up to Yerushalayim, there were also spread over all the cities in Eretz Yisrael. There were representatives of these 24 groups, or they made up the 24 groups of Yisraelim, and we're about to see what happened every week when that group of Yisraelim, some were in Yerushalayim, and those that were not in Yerushalayim, they were in their respective cities, and they would get together, and they would fast, and they would daven for the success of the Korbanos, they would read from the Torah, etc. Says the Gemara Tonu Rabbanon, Estrim v'arba mishmoris hoyu be'eretz Yisrael. There were 24 groups in Eretz Yisrael. Ushtem esri b'Yerichai. And a simple reading of this brayso would be, and another 12 in Yerichai, which was like a contradiction, because if you've got 24 plus 12, you don't have 24, you have 36. So how do we understand this? That a seeming total of Esrim v'arba mishmoris, and then saying 12 in Yerichai, which would make the total 36. Asks the Gemara, Shteim esri b'Yerichai, if you have an extra 12 in Yerichai, then Nefishin luhutuva, then you have many more than 24 in Eretz Yisrael, you have 36. Answers the Gemara, Eloshtem esrei mehen b'Yerichai. Of the 24, 12 of them were in Yerichai. And we soon have to see exactly what that means. Does that mean that half the groups were in Yerichai? It's not what it's going to mean. It continues the Brisa. The Brisa started off saying there's 24 Mishmoris in total in Eretz Yisrael, of which 12 are in Yerichai. Continues the Brisa. Higiaz mana Mishmar Lalois, when it was time for a particular Mishmar to go up, it was their time, their week, then Chetzi HaMishmar Hoya Oile Meretz Yisrael Yerushalayim, the Chetzi HaMishmar Hoya Oile Yerichai. Rashi says it should say Le Yerichai. And what the Gemara means, it's a bit complicated with the different versions in this Gemara, but what the Gemara means, according to Rashi, is that every week, half of the Mishmar, half of the group would go to Yerushalayim, and half of the group would go to Yerichai. So if you have half of each group of 24 groups, you have a total, through the year, you have a total of 12 groups that are going to Yericho. And the reason they would go to Yericho is in order that they can supply food and drink from which was plentiful in Yericho, in order to make sure that the people going up to Yerushalayim would have what to eat in Yerushalayim. And this is here talking about the groups of people who are not the Yisraelim. It's those that were working in the Beis Hamikdash, because the Yisraelim, they stayed in their respective towns. It was the Kohanim, the Leviim, that were split up. That means every group, according to this brisa, half of the group went to work and half of the group went to Yericho. And the some Mefarshim will say that they actually switched in the middle of the week, that those that went initially to work in the Beis Hamikdash came to Yericho, and those that were in Yericho preparing the food for the people in Yerushalayim would then go and work in the Beis Hamikdash. Continues the Gemara, Omer of Yodam Shmuel. Kohanim uleviim v'Yisraelim ma'akvenes hakorban. This concept of the Mishmoris and the Mamodos having a representation of Kohanim, Leviim and Yisraelim are ma'akev for the korban, and it's essential for the validity of the korban. B'masnita Tana, in another Mishnah, in another brisa we learned, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he held that Kohanim, Leviim, and this is not to exclude Yisraelim, they are actually ma'akev, but not only that, Reb Shimon ben Elazar adds on a detail, uklei shir, that also musical instruments are ma'akvenes hakorban, are essential for the validity of the korban. B'maiko miflegi, what are the two arguing? Shmuel didn't mention the musical instruments, and Reb Shimon ben Elazar did. Answers the Gemara, Marasova, Shmuel holds ikashira b'peh, that the main requirement of singing with the korban when the korban was being brought was the singing with the mouths, and the musical instrument was just for accompaniment, and therefore in the absence of those instruments the korban was still valid. Umarasova, however, Reb Shimon ben Elazar held ikashira b'kli, the essential part of the singing was the instruments, and therefore in the absence of the instruments there would be lacking in the validity of the korban. Continues the Gemara, Omer Rav Chomer bar Guria, Omer Rav. Rav Chomer bar Guria said in the name of Rav, and now we're going to discuss how these 24 evolved. It was in a number of stages. There was Moshe Rabbeinu, Shmuel Hanavi, and David HaMelech. And Moshe started this concept, and it was only later on by David HaMelech who actually brought it to its final point of the 24. So let's see who did what. Moshe Tikkun Lem Yisrael, it was Moshe who first instituted for the Klal Yisrael Shmoino Mishmoris, that there should be 8 groups from the Kohanim. We're now talking about the 24 groups of Kohanim that would have a rota of doing the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So Moshe Rabbeinu instituted there would be 8 Mishmoris of Kohanim in total, Arba me'Elazar v'Arba me'Isamar. Aaron HaKohen had 2 surviving sons, Elazar and Isamar. The other 2, Nadav and Avihu, passed away. And from Elazar and Isamar, there were 4 groups of Kohanim to each, and they made a rota. They had a cycle every week. Another group would work in the Beis Hamikdash. That was in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ba Shmuel, in the time of Shmuel Hanavi, ve'emidon al 16, he doubled them. He made it not 8 groups, since there were many more Kohanim in the time of Shmuel Hanavi, and therefore we had to create more groups. So now there was a group of 6. There were 16 groups, not just 8 groups. Bar David, in the time of David HaMelech, that was later than Shmuel. We know that David HaMelech only became the king after Shmuel passed away. This is something we've already discussed early on in the Masechta. Ve'emidon alesim v'arba, and David HaMelech, he established that there would actually be 24 groups. Shneimar, as it says in the Pasuk, in Divrei Hayomim, Lachevroini Uriah Haroish, Lachevroini Leteldoisov La'avois Bishnas Ha'arboim Lemalchus. David, the 40th year of David's reign, Nidrashu Vayimotze Bohem Giboirei Chayil B'Yazer Gilad. So we see that it was in the time in Divrei Hayomim, that Divrei Hayomim tells us that it was David HaMelech who actually instituted in the Psukim there, that we have the list of the 24 groups of Kohanim. And now the Gemara is going to ask against what Rav Chomer bar Guria said in the name of Rav. Meisvei, Moshe Tikein Lem Yisrael Shmoino Mishmoris. We have in a brisa that Moshe instituted 8 Mishmoris, Arba me'Elazar v'Arba me'Isamar. In this aspect, it's the same as Rav. Ba David v'Shmuel. Now it seems that David and Shmuel together came, Hemidon al 24, and they established that it wasn't going to be 8 in total, it was going to be 24. Shenemer, as it says in the Pasuk, again in Divrei Yomim, Kulam habrurim lashoyarim basifim mosayim ushnei mosa heimo b'chatzreihem hisyachsom heimo yisad David u'Shmuel haroya be'emunosam. And in that pasuk you see that the 24 groups were established by David or Shmuel together. And this is not like what Rav said, that it was Shmuel that made it from 8 to 16 and David that turned it from 16 to 24. Here we see that it was David and Shmuel together that moved it from 8 to 24. Answers the Gemara, Hachi Ka'amar. Miyasoidei shel David or Shmuel, it was from the establishment, it was David and Shmuel together, or Shmuel Aramasi, that between the two of them, Hemidon al 24. But it's true, they didn't do it together. It was between them that what Moshe started with 8, finished at 24. How between them did that happen? That's what Rav said, that Shmuel, he made the 16, and David the 24. Tani Edoch, now another brisa. Moshe tikkun lem Yisrael. In this brisa it says that Moshe instituted not 8 mishmoris, rather 16 mishmoris, 16 mishmoris, shmoino me'elazar v'shmoino me'isamar. And this is half, this is like double of what Rav said. What was said before, B'chama Bar Guri, in the name of Rav, said that Moshe instituted 8, 4 and 4, and in this brisa it said, and we actually had a brisa like that, the brisa a few lines earlier, it said the same thing. But in this brisa it says that Moshe Rabbeinu made the 16. At some stage later on, when the descendants of Elazar multiplied much more than those of Isamar, then Chalkum, each one of the 8 of Elazar was doubled. That means was actually halved. Each group was made into 2 half groups, and now you had 16. Ve'midon al 24. So Isamar stayed with 8, and we had 16 from Elazar. Together you had 24. Shenemer, as it says in the Pasuk, and here again in Divrei Yomim, Vayimotzu b'nei Elazar Rabim, that it was found that the descendants of Elazar had multiplied much more, l'roshi agvorim min b'nei Isamar, they multiplied much more than those of Isamar. Vayechalkum l'vnei Elazar roshim leveis avois shisha osar, v'levnei Isamar leveis avoisam shmoina. It's an explicit Pasuk that the bottom line was that there was 16 from Elazar and 8 from Isamar. V'omer, and there's another pasuk, we'll soon see why it was necessary to bring this second pasuk. But in another pasuk it says in Divrei Yomim, a couple of psukim later it says, Vayichtevim Shemaya ben Nesanel Asoifem min Halevi lifnei HaMelech v'asorim v'tzodik HaKohen v'Achimelech ben Evyasar v'roshei ha'ovois l'koyanim v'la'leviyim base of Echod Ochuz le'Elazar, v'Ochuz le'Isamar, which means that they added for each group of Elazar, they established another group, but the original groups that Isamar had, which was Ochuz, it was what was already established by Isamar, that stayed with Isamar, and nothing new was established by Isamar. And the Gemara is now asking, why was it necessary to bring the second pasuk? Answers the Gemara, I may have thought if you just bring the first pasuk just says that Elazar multiplied much more than Isamar, and therefore Elazar had 16 and Isamar 8. But it doesn't tell us that they both started with 8. Maybe they both started with 4. We don't know that. So, v'chitema, are you going to say, Ki heichad nefisha b'nei Elazar, hochanami nefisha b'nei Isamar, shmoina me'ikara arba'a havu? Could it be that in the same way as you doubled Elazar, which means that possibly we would have thought that Elazar had 8 and became 16, and Isamar had 4 and it became 8? Well, you don't know that. How do you know that Isamar always had 8 and stayed with 8? Toshima, that's why we bring the second pasuk that says, base of Echod, Ochuz le'Elazar, v'Ochuz, Ochuz le'Isamar, that Isamar, who finished with 8, started with 8. Nothing was added to Isamar. And it was only Elazar who had 8, and it doubled to 16. Now the Gemara is asking, Tiyuftadur of Chama Bar Guria. This second brisa says that Moshe instituted 16, 8 and 8, is contrary to what Rav Chama bar Guria said in the name of Rav that Moshe instituted 8, 4 and 4. Answers the Gemara, Omelacha Rav Chama bar Guria, Tanoihi, it's a machlekes Tanoim. You yourself saw in the Brisa just a few lines earlier that there's a Brisa that says that Moshe instituted 8. So Rav was following that Brisa. And I hold, this is what Rav Chana bar Guria will say, that you can see it's a machlekes Tanoim, and I hold like the Tana de Omar Shmoino that says that Moshe instituted just 8. Continues the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanon, Arba Mishmoris Olu Min HaGoyla. After the 70 years of Golus Bovel, there were 4 Mishmoris that volunteered and actually came back to Yerushalayim to work in the Beis HaMikdash, and all the others, they stayed in Bovel. They didn't want to come back to Eretz Yisrael. Ve'eluhen, who were they? They were Yedoya, Chorim, Pashchur, and Imor. So on them, because they, in gratitude or in reciprocation for the fact that they came back, Omdu Neviim Shebenim, the Neviim amongst them, they stood up, V'chilkom ve'emidom al esrim ve'arba. And they said, these 4, in the second Beis HaMikdash, these 4 are going to make up all the 24 groups. In the first Beis HaMikdash, there are 24 groups, as we discussed. And now in the second Beis HaMikdash, these 4, each one is going to be split into 6, and they're going to make up the 24 groups. How did they do that? So they took some heads of the families of these 4 general families, and ubolulum v'nosnum bekalpi. They wrote the names. That means of these 4, each one within their large extended families, they split into 6, and they wrote the names of each of the 6, in total 24 names, and put them into the lottery box. Bo Yedoya came, he was the first, and he pulled out the 6 ballots, 6 pieces of paper, 6 names. And it was a big nest, it was a Ruach HaKodesh, that he picked exactly the 6 names that were the 6 of his family. Because there were 24 names in that box. He picked out with Ruach HaKodesh 6, and the reason they did this was in order to know the order that these 6 would be working. V'not al chelko, he picked out his own name first, v'chelik haveirov, and the other 5 he picked up was the 5 new families that were added now within his family. That was altogether sheish, that was altogether 6. And then Bo Chorim, then the next one came, v'not al chelko v'chelik haveiroi, he pulled out 6 pieces, his own plus the new 5 that were associated to his broader family, and that was the next 6 who would be working in the Beis HaMikdash. V'chein Pashcher, the same happened with Pashcher. V'chein Imor, and the same happened with Imor. And this is how Rashi in Erechin Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis explains this Gemara. V'chein Hisnu Neviim Shebeneim, and the Neviim between them, they stipulated as follows: She'afilu Yehoyadav Rosh Mishmoris, even if Yehoyadav, who was the first of all the groups to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, in the first Beis HaMikdash, even if he will be Oile, he will come from Bovel up to Eretz Yisrael, Lo Yidche Yedoya Mimekoimoi, he's not going to move Yedoya, which was the first of these families that did come up with Ezra at the end of the Golus, he's not going to budge him, Elo Yedayo Ika V'Yehoyadav Tofeloi. If Yehoyadav comes up, he will be place number 6 after 5 of Yedoya, because you can't have more than 24, and therefore, in the event that this Yehoyadav is going to come up, then because of him, now Yedoya is going to be 5 groups, not 6 group, and the 6th group is going to be Yehoyadav. Continues the Gemara. V'Yisrael sheba'osei mishmar, the Yisraelim, those that were chosen, who are not Kohanim or Leviim, that were associated to the group of that week, Niskansim Ba'areim, the people who are not in Yerushalayim, they would gather in their cities, V'koirin b'Maaseh Bereishis, they would read from the Sefer Torah, Maaseh Bereishis, as we saw in the Mishnah. Asks the Gemara, Minoha Nemili, what would be the source for that? What's the being engaged in the Korbanos of Klal Yisrael got to do with the creation of the world? And the Maaseh Bereishis is the Psukim discussing creation. Omer of Yaakov bar Choma, Omer of Asi, Ilmolei Ma'modos, because if not for the issue around the Korbanos, Lo niskaimu shemayim va'aretz, heaven and earth will not stand, cannot stand. Shenemer, as it says in the Posuk, Vayomer Hashem Elokim, that Avraham addressed Hashem and said, Bamo Eida ki erosheno, with what will I know that my descendants are going to inherit Klal Yisrael? And what was going on? What made Avraham Avinu ask Hashem? Hashem promised Eretz Yisrael to his descendants, but what made Avraham ask this question? So the Gemara explains, Omar Avraham. Avraham said to Hashem as follows, Ribono shel olam, Shemu Yisrael choitim lefanecha. Maybe Klal Yisrael will sin before you, and you're going to do to them Kedoira Mabul or Kedoira Floga. You'll either kill them all like with the flood, or you disperse them all around the world like the Doira Floga. Omar Leis, Hashem said to Avraham Avinu, Lav, I won't do that. Omar Lefonov. So Avraham said to Hashem, Ribono shel olam, hoidi'eni b'mei iroshena. Let me know how can I be sure that we're going to remain deserving of inheriting Eretz Yisrael? Omar Leis, Hashem said to Avraham Avinu, Kacholi, take for me egla mushuleshes, 3 calves, v'eiz mushuleshes, and 3 goats, v'ayil mushulash, v'soir, v'goizel. And what Hashem was telling Avraham Avinu was that all the while that Klal Yisrael have the korbanos, you can be safe and you can know that you're going to stay in Eretz Yisrael. Omar Lefonov, so Avraham Avinu said to Hashem, Ribono shel olam, Tinach bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim. All the while there's a Beis Hamikdash. I understand there's going to be the korbanos, and that will keep Klal Yisrael on the straight and narrow. Bizman she'ein Beis Hamikdash kayim mata eleim. What's going to be with Klal Yisrael after the Beis Hamikdash is going to be when there's no Beis Hamikdash? Omar Lois, Hashem said to Avraham Avinu, Kvar tikanti lohem seder korbanos. I already instituted for them the reading, the psukim of the korbanos in the Chumash. Bizman shekoirin behem lefonai, when they read these psukim before me, ma'ale ani aleim ki'ilu ekrivum lefonai, then it's considered to me as if they are bringing the korbanos. V'ani moichel lehem al kol avonoseihem, and I forgive them for all their sins. So you see here that the surviving of Klal Yisrael and hence the world is only because of the korbanos. And that's why the people of the Mamodos and all the people in all these cities who were representing Klal Yisrael and the groups that were representing Klal Yisrael, they were davening for the success of the korbanos, and they would read from this parasha, the parasha of the creation of the world. Continues the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanon, Anshe Mishmar. Some suggest it's really referring to the Anshe Mamodos, and these are the people in Yerushalayim. Hoyu mispalelim al korban achiyam shispalel barotzin. They would daven that the korbanos of their brethren, which are being brought on their behalf in the Beis Hamikdash, should be well received in Shemaim. Va'anshe Maimad, which is it seems to be referring to these Anshe Mishmar, these representatives in all the cities. Miskansin lebeis hakneses, they would gather in the shuls, v'yoshvin dalet taniyos, and they would fast for 4 days of the week, b'sheni b'Shabbos on Monday, b'shlishi b'Revi'u b'chamishi, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And b'sheni, what would they daven for in particular on the Mondays? Al Yerdayom, on the sailors, on the people at sea, because on the second day of creation it says Yehira Kia B'Soich HaMayim, and therefore we want to make sure that there's an appeasement and that everything is okay with the water, so they would daven for the Yerid Hayom, the people at sea. B'Shlishi, on Tuesdays, they would daven in particular Al Hulchi Midboris, because it was on the third day that Hashem created the dry land. B'Revi, on Wednesdays, Al Askara, an inflammation which is a very deadly disease that starts in the throat, and they would daven for that people shouldn't get hurt by this illness called Askara. And this is associated to Wednesday, because on Wednesday, when Hashem created the sun and the moon, it says that Hashem created Yehi Ma'oros, and Ma'oros is actually written without the vovs, Me'eras, which alludes to these dangerous illnesses. Sheloi tipol alatinoikas, that the children should not die from this illness, and this illness should not befall them. B'chamishi, on Thursdays, al ubrois u'meinikos. Then, since it speaks in the post on Thursdays, it speaks about yishrutzu amayim sheretz nefesh chaya, that there's a yishrutzu, there's a becoming many. And therefore, they would daven for the ubrois or menikos, the ubrois, the pregnant women, shalei apilu, they should not miscarry, and menikos, those who are nursing, she'enikos b'neim, should be able to nurse their children. Ube'erev Shabbos, on Fridays, lo yahayu mis'anen mipnei kvod Shabbos, they would not fast because of kavod Shabbos. It's not honorable for Shabbos to come into Shabbos starving. Kal v'chomer b'Shabbos atzmo, it goes without saying that they would not fast on Shabbos itself. Be'echad b'Shabbos mai ta'ama loy, why would they not fast on Sundays? Omer Rabbi Yochanan, there's going to be three explanations in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says mipnei hanotzrim, because of the notzrim, who they have their holidays on Sundays, and we don't want to be associated in any way to any of these holidays that belong to Avodah Zarah, and therefore on Sundays they would not make any yontiv and they wouldn't fast on that day. Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani Omar mipnei shehu shlishi liyitzira, because man was created on Friday, and therefore Sunday is the third day, and always the third day after creation, similar to a third day after Bris Milah, that after a person is just been created or something very drastic has happened to his body, then he's very weak on the third day. Therefore on Sundays people are weaker. Rish Lakish Omar mipnei neshama yasera. Rish Lakish says because of the neshama yasera. Domer Rish Lakish said that neshama yasera nitna ba'adam be'erev Shabbos. On erev Shabbos, for Shabbos, an extra dose of neshama is given to Klal Yisrael. But Motzei Shabbos noitle noisim mimenu, and on Motzei Shabbos it is taken away from them. And when a person has a neshama yasera, his nefesh is larger, and he can eat and drink l'chvayit Shabbos more. But after Shabbos, it leaves him. Shenema, and this is alluded to in the pasuk that says Shovas vayinofash, referring to the fact that Hashem rested and refreshed himself. And what the Rish Lakish is reading in this pasuk is Shavas, Kivon Shavas, after Shabbos is over, Vayi Nofash, Vayi of the Nefesh, woe to the Nefesh that has gotten lost. And since we've got less Nefesh, therefore it's inappropriate to fast on the Sunday, which is the day after Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. By Yom Rishon, what would the people of these people who are reading Shul, the Mishmoris, the Maimodis, what would they read on the Torah? We said that during the week they read the whole parasha of the creation. What would they read on the Sunday? B'yom Rishon, they would read just the first 2 days, the first day of creation and the second day of creation, Bereshis and Vihirakia. And we discussed at length already in the Mishnah that we need 3 aliyos, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. And the Kohen would get the first aliyah, the Levi, the second aliyah, the Yisrael, the third aliyah, and every aliyah has to be at least 3 psukim. And not all these parashiyos, a parasha which is defined by a pei, by a samach in the Sefer Torah. In the Chumash we can see it printed, pei and samach are 2 different types of endings of a parasha, what we call a parasha. And when you get an aliyah, you have to read at least 3 psukim. That's one thing. Another thing is you can't leave over less than 3 psukim at the end of the parasha, and a number of other conditions. So we have to work out that with every 2 days of creation, that means every 2 parashiyos of that first parak in Sefer Bereshis, in Parashas Bereshis, has to somehow be able to be divided into 3, when we will only divide the parasha if there's at least 6 psukim, that each aliyah can get 3 psukim. And some of the parashas only have 3 psukim, 4 psukim, 5 psukim, 6 psukim, 8 psukim, as we're going to see, or as we saw in the Mishnah. So the Bryce is going to discuss that. Tana, Bereshis, the parasha of Bereshis, B'Shnaim. You can actually call up 2 people with it, even though there's only 5 psukim there. We're going to have to see how that happens. Yehi Rokia be'echod, the parasha of Yehi Rokia, which is the Mondays of creation, is 1 aliyah. So now the Gemara is asking, Bishlo Yehi Rokia be'echod. I can understand why the Monday of creation, the 3rd aliyah of the first day, and the 1st aliyah of the second day, is tlas psukahava. It's only 3 psukim, and therefore it's be'echod, only 1 person can get called up. Elaboratius b'shnayim ma'itama. But the first day of creation, which is only 5 psukim, chamisha psukim havyon, it's only 5 psukim. Utnan, did we not learn in a Mishnah? Hakoira b'Torah, if somebody reads a parasha in the Torah, lo yifchos megimel psukim, you can't give him less than 3 psukim. So if you call up a Kohen and Levi and you divide the 5 psukim, one of them is only going to get 2 psukim. So there's a machlekes how to get around that. Rav Omar Doileg, Rav says that they would jump, which means the first aliyah would be 3 psukim, posuk 1, 2, and 3. The second aliyah would jump back and read posuk 3, 4, and 5. Or Shmuel would say, no, posuk, you split the third posuk. So the Kohen gets posuk 1, posuk 2, and half of posuk 3. The Levi gets the second half of posuk 3, and posuk 4 and posuk 5. Rav de Omar Doilig, my tam Omar posuk. Why did Rav say you jump back and read the third posuk a second time? Why didn't he say you split the posuk? Answers the Gemara, Kosova, because Rav holds Kol psuka de poski Moshe anan loy poskinon lei. If Moshe didn't put an end of a posuk in the middle of the posuk, we don't make an end there either. We don't split up psukim. Or Shmuel Omar posuk. Shmuel says that you are allowed to split up a posuk. Asks the Gemara, mi poskinon? Is that what you're allowed to do, to break up a posuk in the middle? V'ha'omar Reb Chanina Korah. Reb Chanina, who was possibly a Bal Kaira, he was definitely very expert and versed in reading psukim and knowing how to read them, how to punctuate them, and the tamim. And he says, he used to teach children psukim, and he says, Tsar Godel Hoyoli Eitzel Reb Chanina Godel. I had to work very hard and put a lot of effort, and I was very pained, so to speak, when I went to Reb Chanina Godel, and I had to try and encourage him to allow me to split up the psukim when I'm teaching the children, because the children can't deal with learning a whole pasuk at a time. But at the end, he only agreed to me that I can split a pasuk only for the children in school. Since I'm doing it with the intentions of teaching them Chumash. But in any other case, he wouldn't allow me to split up a pasuk. So how can Shmuel say that you split up the pasuk when it's clearly not something that we're encouraged to do? Answers the Gemara, Shmuel Hosam Tamamai Mishum Deloy Efshar. Hachanami Loy Efshar. Shmuel maintained that in the same way as the teacher teaching children, he was allowed to split the psukim because he had no choice. Here too, we have no choice because you're only allowed to read the parasha Aleph and Beis. That means on the first day, on the Sunday, the Maimonides would only read the first 2 days of creation. One of the parashas is 3 psukim. We can only give one aliyah there. The other parasha of 5 psukim, we have no choice. You have no choice. You can split the pasuk. Ushmuel Omar Posuk. Shmuel argued with Rav, and Shmuel said, you split the pasuk. My tamale Omar Doilig. Why didn't he agree with what Rav said? Jump back to pasuk Gimel and read pasuk Gimel a second time. Answers the Gemara, Gzeira mishum hanichnosim or Gzeira mishum hayotzim. We have an issue with that, because if I'm going to stop the first aliyah, the Kohen aliyah, I'm going to stop after the pasuk Gimel, and there's only 2 psukim left in the parasha, the people who are going to leave now, they're going to assume that the next aliyah is going to be just 2 psukim, and that would be a mistake. And also, if the people who come in at the second aliyah and were not there for the first aliyah, they're going to see the second aliyah starting with pasuk Gimel, they're going to think that the first aliyah was just 2 psukim, and either way it's going to be a bad mistake. And therefore Shmuel said there's no such thing as starting at a pasuk Gimel or finishing at the third last pasuk in a parasha, and therefore Shmuel said, I have no choice, I have to split the middle pasuk into 2. That was the Gzeira Mishum HaNichnosim or Gzeira Mishum HaYotzim. Asks the Gemara, Meisvei, we learnt in a Brisa regarding the regular Kriyas HaTorah, the whole year round, not regarding the Maimonides, where they had to read these parashas, they couldn't read more, they couldn't read less. But regarding the Kriyas HaTorah of the whole year, where we learnt that parasha shel shisha psukim, any parasha, any single parasha with 6 psukim, koren oisa b'shnayim, you can give 2 aliyahs, 3 psukim to one, 3 psukim to the other. V'shel chamisha, but if you have a parasha with just 5 psukim, b'yochid, you can only call up 1 person, not 2 people. V'im arisha and koira gimel, and if the first aliyah got 3 psukim, then Hasheni, the second aliyah, koire shnayim miparasha zu, he's got to read 2, the last 2 in this pasuk, ve'echod miparasha acheres, and at least 1 in the next parasha. Some say not 1 pasuk in the next parasha, rather shloisha, 3 psukim in the next parasha. And this opinion holds, you never start reading a parasha and not read at least 3 psukim of it. That's what we learnt in the Brisa. The Gemara is asking, I don't understand. What's the issue? You have a parasha with 5 psukim. We just had Rav and Shmuel who said either you can repeat the 3rd pasuk or you can split the 3rd pasuk. So what's the issue? You have a parasha of 5. Then instead of saying that the second aliyah has to read 1 or 3 psukim from the next parasha, just use one of these solutions. Lemando oma doilig lidolig, lemando oma poisuk liposik. According to Rav, who says that you jump back, let them jump back. According to Shmuel, who says you split the pasuk. Answers the Gemara, Shani Hasam de Isli Ravcha. No, because these solutions of splitting psukim and repeating psukim, that's only if you've got no choice. But a regular Kriyas HaTorah, where you're not restricted, no one's telling you have to stop reading here. So you've got plenty of space to move on. So move on and continue reading. It's only here with the Mamodos where the takana was on day 1 to read only the first 2 days of creation. We have no choice, and therefore we have to do either the doileg or the poisek. And in Mirz Hashem in the next shir, we're going to continue from here.